We'll begin, as we begin all things, with our land acknowledgement. So beginning in 1769, the Rumsen Ohlone peoples were dispossessed of their lands by Spanish missionaries and settlers, who also forcibly expropriated Rumsen labor and perpetrated cultural genocide through coerced baptisms. California's admission to statehood in 1850 subjected the Rumsen Ohlone peoples to a genocidal war of extermination, including slavery, rape, murder for bounty, massacre, and forced removal. And so we acknowledge that the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey sits in the village of Ashasta on the ancestral and unceded land of the Ohlone Rumsen people, a Rumsen-speaking group. Several contemporary nations, including the Esalen, call this land home today. The surrounding Monterey Bay region includes lands traditionally inhabited by the Esalen, Chalon, Mutsun, and Salinan groups. We honor these groups' experiences in the past, present, and future as we work collaboratively with them to protect the land and its inhabitants. We honor these indigenous communities past and present. We give thanks for the opportunity to respectfully share in the bounty of this place and are working collaboratively to protect it. We are all one in the sacred web of life that connects people, animals, plants, air, water, and earth. And so it is my distinct pleasure to welcome our speaker, Dr. Tony Gass, who is the Director of African American Student Development at the Fannie Lou Hamer Black Resource Center and an adjunct professor of African American Studies at UC Berkeley. He received his bachelor's degree in history at Bowie State University, go Bulldogs, his master's in history at Morgan State University, go Bears, and his doctorate from Ohio State University, and I just can't bring myself to root for the Buckeyes.
I don't say either.
All right, we're on the same page there. He has researched extensively on Marcus Garvey and the Universal Negro Improvement Association and the Freedom Movement in Baltimore City. Prior to coming to Berkeley, Dr. Gass served as an administrative associate at the Frank W. Hale Jr. Black Cultural Center at Ohio State, as assistant director of the Black Cultural Center at Purdue University, and he has taught in the Department of History and Government at Bowie State University. He has published his research in prestigious journals, including the Journal of American History. His presentation today is titled The 92% Know Best, Black Women Leadership During the Baltimore Freedom Movement from 1935 to 1975. Dr. Getz.
Thank you. Good afternoon, folks.
Good afternoon.
I want to thank you for your presence. You could have been anywhere else, but you decided to be here, and I'm greatly appreciative of that. Again, I'd like to thank Dr. Curry for the invitation. And the university, the institute itself, particularly, I don't have to let everybody know what kind of climate we're operating in today, where academic freedom has been constantly attacked and assaulted, where education itself has been assaulted from Head Start up. And so one of the things, unfortunately, that we're also seeing is a number of institutions capitulating to these unreasonable, insane demands on them. Some of our supposedly greatest institutions are, to use a Game of Thrones reference for anyone who's ever seen it, bending the knee. And so I think it's really important to acknowledge Middlebury for doing this, having this series, BIPOC Voices, because again, there is an effort made particularly to have scholars of color to denigrate their work, shut out their voices, and things of that nature. So I really want to give respect and appreciation to Nick in the Jedi office, and I love that acronym, to Chelsea for putting the flyer together, appreciate that. And so just honored to be here with you today to talk about something that is very near and dear to my heart. This is actually coming from my dissertation on the Baltimore NAACP. And as anyone who has written a dissertation or even a thesis knows, this is something you live with literally for a number of years. This, this is not a research paper for a semester. This is a body of work where if you're working with subjects such as I have, you get to appreciate them, you live with them, and in some instances, you might get a little sick of them too, in some instances. But I'm happy to, I'm one of those people that loves my subject. I actually, at Ohio State, specialized in 20th century African-American history, particularly the Civil Rights Black Power movement, even though, of course, I love all phases of African-American and African diaspora history, as Nick pointed out. So this is a subject that is near and dear to my heart. Just a little bit more about me, serving as Assistant Director of the Fannie Lou Hamer Black Resource Center at UC Berkeley, which I have been serving in since October of 21, so I came in the midst of the pandemic. I'm originally, of course, from the DC area, and at Bowie State is where Dr. Creary and I met. We also belong to something called Wells-Woodson Renaissance, named after the great Ida B. Wells Barnett and, of course, Dr. Carter G. Woodson. And as we like to joke, we like to say we're a book club that likes to be social, but actually we're a social club that occasionally reads some books. We need to improve that, and we are working on that. But we do enjoy each other's company. We are of like minds, and one of our fellow colleagues and friends, Dr. David Reed, is responsible for creating that. So we are thankful for the space that it is giving us, particularly again in these times where those spaces are becoming less and less, unfortunately. And so in looking at this, because it's been a while since I've spoken on the subject, and when Nick texted me and said, what would you like the title to be? I had to think about it for a minute. And then it just popped in my head, the 92%. For those of you who don't know, the 92% refers to the 92% of Black women who voted for Kamala Harris in this last election. And I would like to also say that, and the numbers vary, but anywhere from, I've seen 75 to 80% of Black men did so as well. And that's very, very significant. And that's not to say that former VP Harris did not have her challenges, did not have her flaws, whatever the case may be. There were some real points that people had in critiquing, her potential leadership of this country, as a prosecutor, as a former, state's attorney, things of that nature, what we've been seeing in Gaza and the policies of the Biden administration. But I say all that to say, despite all of that, if people had listened to the 92%, we would not be in this mess that we are right now. I am very sure of that. We would be affirmed rather than assaulted, in my estimation. And so I wanted to, and as a side note, something that also had me think of the title, when Trevor Noah was leaving his position on the Daily Show, one of the profound things that he said, trust Black women. They've been doing this work for a long time. They've been in the front lines. And I don't have the statistics in front of me, but Black women, are one of the leading groups in seeking higher education. They're also, leading in entrepreneurship and things of that nature. So I personally, in many instances, where they lead, I'm going to follow. And I think you're going to get a sense of that in the individuals, the three very inspirational and very dedicated and committed individuals that I'm going to highlight as I talk about the Baltimore freedom movement overall. And so I want to give you, before I get into them, I want to give you a little bit of background on my home state, because that's where, even though I was born in DC, I grew up in Maryland, Prince George's County, to be exact, which is of course right outside of the city. And when we talk about the civil rights movement, of course, what I call the usual suspects: Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, Texas, Tennessee, so on and so on and so on. And of course, they deserve their spotlight because there were significant changes made in those particular states and of course in the South. But one of the things that people seem to forget is that Maryland is in the South too. Now it's considered Upper South. It does have elements of the North as well because it is on the border of the Mason-Dixon line, the imaginary line that supposedly separates the North from the South. But it's the South nevertheless. And though African Americans there may have still been able to vote and hold political office, it was still segregated. Maryland was a slave state that in many instances could have very easily swayed toward a Confederacy side. It almost did in some instances. And so what I found in reading on the civil rights movement is African American freedom movement in Maryland has received little attention compared to other states. And I'm going to confess I was guilty of this myself. I did not know before I really started doing this research, and I had heard here and there, but I really didn't know until I started doing this research, how significant and important the movement in Baltimore and subsequently the state was in terms of being the beginning to the road to Brown and some other significant landmark achievements. And again, as we can see several reasons that that Maryland may not have gotten its shine. Again, it's a border state, contains all aspects of the region, so it's kind of difficult to place. George Calcutt, who has written extensively on Maryland history, calls the state Maryland in miniature because, again, it has southern influences, it has northern influences, but also due to the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, it also has influences from the Midwest as well. So again, you've got these burgeoning regions converging in this small state. So that's one. And then if any area of Maryland, of course, has received attention, it has been Cambridge with Gloria Richardson, Dandridge, and the Cambridge nonviolent action, movement there, which stemmed from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee of the early 1960s, where they, of course, experienced rampant racial violence that was similar to what activists were experiencing in the Deep South, like Mississippi and Alabama, and in some instances was even more dangerous, if you can imagine that. And then again, being a border state, complex race relationships that were often contradictory. Again, African Americans could vote, they could hold political office. So you had that, you did have viable African American communities, but at the same time, like other southern states, you did have segregation. You did have colored and white signs. You did have African Americans having to acquiesce to the etiquette of Jim Crow as well. And even though you did have pockets of, say, domestic terrorist organizations like the Klan, most of the racism that African Americans and other people of color experiences was of the polite variety. And of course, putting that in air quotes because it's all rude. But, it's not being called racial slurs to your face, but it is, say, being stifled in housing, in education, in employment, having a ceiling on how far you can go, where you can live, what places you can occupy. And so again, Maryland, some people find it difficult because of that to solidly put Maryland in the South. And let's focus on its largest and most populous city, Baltimore. And there's a reason why it's named a mean city. And Juanita Jackson Mitchell, who I will highlight a little bit later, who was raised in Baltimore, designated it as so. She said that this was a city that, was not welcoming, was not comfortable with the presence of African Americans. Another Baltimore neighbor put it like this. Of course, I believe you've heard of Thurgood Marshall. He called it Up South Baltimore. That's what he called it. He called it Up South Baltimore. Because again, African Americans could vote, they could hold political office. They were not as segregated as some other places. You could ride streetcars on a non-segregated basis, but everything else was segregated. And so, and also African Americans were largely confined to certain sections of the city. Some of that were in the southern regions of Baltimore. Some African Americans would migrate to what they call the northwest section of the city, and they lived in other pockets around the city as well. And again, African Americans were either barred from or restricted to certain fields of employment. For example, you could be trained to be a chemist, but sometimes the only position that you can find was a janitor. And there was very little upward mobility in some of these positions. So African Americans had to deal with that. And I should also say, as it comes to mind, how many of you have ever heard of restrictive covenants? Okay, for those of you who have not, restrictive covenants basically, say you buy a home and you may be ready to sell that home. You either sign this contract with either your lender or the bank or the real estate agency that says, when I sell this home, I will not sell it to a Negro or a Jew or an Asian or a Mexican or wherever you happen to be, or a Native American, indigenous person. I will not rent to them. If you own a business, I will not allow their business to occupy these particular spaces. Baltimore was the first place where these things were found and formed, to restrict where people lived, where businesses could be, and things of that nature. So that's just one example. And of course, this went across the country. Little tidbit, in places like Minneapolis, some restrictive covenants are still in effect. There's a project now that is going through to look at them and of course negate them, but some of these racial covenants technically by law are still in effect, unfortunately. And surprisingly, when I tell my students this is not Birmingham, Alabama or Jackson, Mississippi. This is Minneapolis, Minnesota, Chicago, Illinois, Detroit, Michigan. These are very northern cities. So again, we understand that even though it was more blatant in the South, as far as Jim Crow was concerned, it was nationwide, from Maine to Montana to Washington State. Why Baltimore? Why did the road to Brown start in this particular city? Well, a couple of reasons. Again, a large and very vibrant Black community. They called it Old Northwest Baltimore. That was the heart of it. It had Pennsylvania Avenue running through it, similar to U Street in Washington, D.C., which is right below Howard University, Vine Street in Kansas City, Missouri, and a number of other streets. That was the center of the African-American community. And of course, that's where all the shops and businesses and the nightclubs, particularly the Royal Theater, which, if you ever heard of the Apollo Theater, was on part of what they call the Chitlin Circuit, where Black performers would, many of these clubs were white owned, but they catered to African-American, sometimes African-American audiences, but they definitely, of course, had African-American musicians and entertainers and actors perform there. And so you had the Apollo in New York, you had the Royal in Baltimore, you had the Earl in Philadelphia, and you had a number of others in places like Chicago. And so the Royal was the centerpiece of African-American nightlife in the city, enough to where soldiers who were stationed in various bases around the state, because segregation limited where they could go, many of them also gravitated to the Royal, even if they're coming from the Eastern Shore, which is about almost 2 hours away. Again, African Americans could vote and hold political office, which they did. Close proximity to the nation's capital, of course, depending on traffic, it's about a 45-minute drive from Washington, D.C. It had one of the earliest branches of the NAACP, of course, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. In fact, it was the second branch of the association after its founding branch in New York City in 1909. The Baltimore branch was founded, I believe, around 1913. And so Baltimore was one of the earliest branches of the association. And one of the other linchpins that made Baltimore such an attractive place for this to get started was it was the home of the Afro, more specifically the Baltimore Afro-American. Of course, African-Americans shortened it to the Afro. It was one of 3 major Black newspapers during that particular time, and it competed with 2 others, the Chicago Defender, which was edited by Robert Abbott, and the Pittsburgh Courier, which was edited by Robert Vann. The Afro was edited by Carl Murphy, and the Murphys were a long-time established African-American family in the city, and Carl Murphy's father actually founded the newspaper by buying and combining 2 former Black newspapers that were in danger of going out of business. And so Murphy built the Afro into one of the major voices of the African-American community in Maryland. So we go from the early 20th century to, and again, you've got 1913, the founding of the association. You have the branch fighting early against restrictive covenants and other forms of racial segregation. But unfortunately and inevitably, every organization has peaks and valleys. And so I would say from about the early 1920s until about 1931, 32, the branch is going to become stagnant. The branch is going to become morbid. One main reason was there was no consistent leadership there. Many of the early branch presidents had to make a living, to be very, very frank. And so sometimes they could not devote the energy and the time to effectively lead the branch. And so you did see quite a bit of turnover in leadership. And then in some instances, unfortunately, the branch also had to deal with malfeasance in leadership, particularly as unfortunately most organizations deal with, somebody is dipping into the bank account. All right. And so you've had that as well. And so by the midst of the Great Depression, the beginnings of the Great Depression, the branch is not operating as it once did. And so African Americans are looking, again, because of its important work before, because of it being the first branch outside of the mother branch, if you will, African Americans wanted to revive it. But before that happened, you saw the appearance of the citywide Young People's Forum. And that was due to the 2 young ladies who are sitting in the middle. Juanita is holding the child. Her older sister, Virginia, is in the black right next to her. They founded this youth organization. Both of them had been educated in Pennsylvania, again, because of segregation. Their mother, Lillie Carroll Jackson, who was front row far right, did not want her daughters to attend segregated institutions, and so she sent both of them to Pennsylvania. Juanita to the University of Pennsylvania, and Virginia went to the Pennsylvania Institute for Art. And both of them graduated in 1931. And again, we're in the beginnings of the Great Depression, and so coming home to Baltimore, it was very difficult for them to find employment. Now, of course, it's difficult for many people to find employment, but if you're African American, it's doubly difficult to find employment. And then if you're an African American woman, it's triply difficult to find employment. And so they both came home with these expectations that had not been fulfilled, but they were looking for something to do because their family were devout Methodists, and we all know, an idle mind is the devil's workshop. They decided to keep busy that they were going to address some of the inequities and injustices that were occurring in the city. And so they created the citywide Young People's Forum. Now, it began as a gathering place for young folks to coalesce, to build community, because of course, the Jackson sisters were not the only one that were finding it difficult to find employment. And so they were coalescing with other youth to create a community. They were sponsoring lectures. They were trying to, build their resumes and find employment and things of that nature. But again, because of the segregation and Jim Crow racism that they were experiencing in Baltimore, it did not take long for them to want to address that. And we know how young people are. They're fearless in many instances. Sometimes, good or bad, you can't tell them nothing until they experience it. But again, it was that fearlessness. It was that, in some instances, invincibility that they felt that they were the perfect people to try to address this. This is not to say that adults did not do so, but in many instances, of course, adults have responsibilities that young folks did not. You gotta pay the rent, you gotta pay the mortgage, you gotta, feed and take care of your kids. You have to have shelter and things of that nature. And so sometimes those responsibilities tempered what activist spirit, or activities they may have wanted to engage in. And so so soon after that, they wanted to address inequities, and one of the great ways to do that was participating in the Don't Buy Where You Can't Work boycott campaign. Now, that did not start in Baltimore. That actually started in other cities. And basically the gist of it is, we won't patronize where we can't work. So if you're not going to employ us, you're not going to get our dollars. And eventually, this is going to be a nationwide boycott of African Americans. And the Young People's Forum, or the Forum as it came to be known, saw that on Pennsylvania Avenue. Again, these businesses allowed them in, if that, because in some instances, the way segregation worked in Baltimore, in Mississippi or Alabama, even though the establishment was segregated, you couldn't enter. Some stores in Baltimore, you couldn't even enter if you were African American. So those you could enter, they will take your money, but of course, they will not employ you there. And as I said, Pennsylvania Avenue was the heart of the African American community, but you did have segregated businesses there. And so the Forum, young people would approach the owners or the managers and, ask to be employed, to take resumes, accept resumes and things of that nature. And of course, they would be rejected. And once they were rejected, then they started picketing these businesses and, trying to have as constant of a presence in front of these businesses with their signs and things of that nature. They call for an economic boycott, so on and so on. So that would exist in 1933, 1934. And because of their activities, I should also say, the Forum, not only did they get local and state notoriety, but they also started to get national notoriety because leaders of the NAACP started to take notice, such as W.E.B. Du Bois, such as James Weldon Johnson, such as Walter White, who would be the longtime executive secretary of the NAACP. So not only is this gaining headlines locally, but national African American leaders are also keeping their eyes on this. One of the people that is going to support the Forum is a man named Charles Hamilton Houston. By show of hands, has anyone ever heard of Charles Hamilton Houston? Okay. For those of you who have not, he was Thurgood Marshall's teacher. He was the man who helped to revitalize the Howard Law School. And Houston had a quote that I love. He said, if you're a black lawyer, and of course they use the word Negro, he said, if you're a Negro lawyer during these times, you're one of two things. You're either a social engineer or you're a parasite. You're either a social engineer or you're a parasite. And what he was saying is, we need to use the law for our intents and purposes. We need to stop being reactive and be proactive. And so Charles Hamilton Houston, who was also a native Washingtonian, would not only revitalize Howard Law School and create a cadre of black lawyers who would proactively use the law to benefit, of course, not only African Americans, but Americans, period. But he also headed the inaugural NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund that was to put together the strategy that eventually led to Brown versus Board of Education in May of 1954, which unfortunately he did not live to see. He passed in, I believe, 1950. But his work, of course, and his legacy carries on even to this day. So he was also one of the major supporters of the forum, and their activities caught his attention as well. And what was the impact of this dynamic organization? Well, again, the forum attracted the attention of such luminaries as Du Bois and Walter White and Mary McLeod Bethune and Nannie Helen Burroughs, who, like Mary McLeod Bethune, was an educator. She had an independent school for Black women and girls in Washington, D.C. It was Burroughs who stated the forum is, quote, the best, most progressive and analytical organization of young people in America. It feels, thinks, believes, and more importantly, acts. And so because of her leadership, now, even though her sister Virginia helped to found it, Virginia would phase out, and so Juanita would take over the leadership of the Young People's Forum. And she did so well that Walter White tapped her to serve not only as his assistant, as executive secretary, and you know, the executive secretary of the NAACP takes care of the day-to-day logistics and administrative work of the organization. But he later on put her in charge of revitalizing the youth and college division because of her work in engaging and organizing young people. So again, her work and her, her achievements not only gained local fame, but national fame as well. And this is where I get to the women that I would love for you to know and highlight. They are pictured here, of course, Juanita Jackson, who would later be Juanita Jackson Mitchell after Marion Clarence Mitchell Jr., her mother, Lillie Carroll Jackson, and in the upper left-hand corner is Enolia McMillan. These women, these three women, and sometimes having parallel leadership positions, sometimes taking over or continuing the work of their predecessor, these Black women would lead the freedom movement in Baltimore for over 50 years. That is unprecedented in terms of the freedom movement. Because as we know, in many instances, of course, we give honor and grace to Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and others. But I would say not until maybe the last 20 years, particularly in civil rights historiography, have we been focusing and emphasizing the contributions of Black women to the freedom movement within the United States. People such as Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, September Clark, Bernice Robinson, Gloria Richardson, and others. And so we know in many instances, leadership is supposedly a male-dominated domain. Men are, some people believe that men are not only born to lead, but they're chosen to lead. And so to have this very important freedom movement be led not only by three Black women, but for as long as they did, I don't, at least in my research up to now, I do not find any other example of that happening anytime or anywhere during the civil rights movement. Now, there were Black women leaders, of course. Daisy Bates in Little Rock, Arkansas, she led the NAACP chapter. There was Lulu White in Texas. She also had an important position in NAACP. People like Ruby Doris Robinson and others would be in leaderships of organizations, but to have it go this long, again, is unprecedented. And who are these women? Well, let me introduce them to you. First, of course, Juanita Jackson Mitchell, born in Hot Springs, Arkansas. Again, her parents were traveling Methodists, so they would evangelize around the country. And she, Virginia, and I believe their younger sister, Marion, were born in Hot Springs, Arkansas. The family eventually made their way back to her mother's hometown of Baltimore. And as I said, she graduated from the University of Pennsylvania. Now, Juanita was extraordinarily intelligent. She entered college when most people were graduating high school. All right? And so I believe 2 years before most people are graduating high school. And she had that aptitude, that intelligence that her mother, her parents recognized very early and wanted to cultivate that. And so they sent her to the University of Pennsylvania, again, an Ivy League institution, where she received her BA cum laude in 1931. And while there, she helped to segregate some of the women's dormitories. So she was an activist at a very young age. And as I said, co-founded the Young People's Forum, served as special assistant to NAACP Executive Secretary Walter White in the 1930s, and then later progressed to the national director of the NAACP Youth and College Division. She would again marry Clarence Mitchell Jr., who was initially a member of the Urban League, of course, would later become head of the Washington Bureau of the NAACP, and he was nicknamed the 101st Senator because of his tireless efforts to get civil rights legislation passed. And so after their marriage, she would travel with him. I believe they spent some time in Minnesota and some other places. But she again would eventually come back to Maryland, and she would be the first Black woman to not only graduate from the University of Maryland's law school, but also the first Black woman to practice law in the state in 1950. So again, Juanita is a trailblazer. Juanita is someone who is not going to rest on her laurels. If she doesn't see that it's happening, she's going to make it happen, for better or worse. Her mother was responsible for a lot of that. And her mother is one of those extraordinary people that has been a joy to read and learn about. Again, born in 1889 in Baltimore. She was a successful business person. She and her husband, but mainly herself, owned and managed rental properties, which means she had an independent salary, independent means, more so than the majority of African Americans. And because of her daughter's activism and supporting her daughter, she was the one that helped to raise funds for the forum. Because she was so connected with the church and such a pillar in her church, United Methodist Church, she was the one that coalesced parents to support these young people and also raise the funds. And she was an extraordinary fundraiser. Can't do much without money, unfortunately. And so she would be the one to raise that money. And because of her activities, because of her leadership, because of her reputation in the city, she was tapped when they wanted to revitalize the Baltimore branch. She was tapped to do so. And so she, as you can see, was served as president, the longest serving president from 1935 to 1970. And not only that, but she would also serve as president of the Maryland State Conference of NAACP branches. So she would not only direct the local movement in Baltimore, but she also helped to direct the local movement in the state itself. And then, of course, on the national levels, she will also be a member of the national board of the NAACP. And it was under her leadership that it became one of the largest financially stable and successful branches of the association. Real quickly, Dr. Jackson, and I'll give her her honor because she was bestowed an honorary doctorate from Morgan State University, was a character, to say the least. She famously said, "God opened my mouth and no man can shut it." She was one of those people that if you didn't want to know what she really thought, you don't ask her because she's going to tell you. Theodore McKeldin, who was twice served as mayor of Baltimore, twice served as governor of Maryland, will be considered liberal in today's age. He once said, "I would rather have the devil after me than Mrs. Jackson." Because Miss Jackson was going to hold you accountable. If you said you were going to do something, she was going to make sure you did it. She did not care what you thought of what she said. She was going to say it anyway. And Dr. Jackson, in some instances, wasn't a respecter of person. She probably now out Jesus Christ. I'm just saying. Okay? She probably on Christ himself. But she again, her work ethic, her determination, her dedication, her resolve, and her fortitude is what has her stand out. And if you notice, she herself is a personal victim of Jim Crow discrimination. She was experiencing terrible headaches, and once they operated at Johns Hopkins, which was one of the few hospitals at that time that was admitting Black patients located in Baltimore, they had to take a lot of decayed bone out of her skull. Well, in doing that, in suturing her up, they severed a nerve in her face. So that's the reason why her jaw is sagging. So again, personally touched by, and again, having to find Johns Hopkins at the last moment because other hospitals, because of segregation, would not admit her. She could have died, actually. They caught it at the 11th hour in many instances. So personally touched by, the racial discrimination that African Americans had to endure. And again, Lillie Jackson was one of those people that said what she meant what she said, and put her money where her mouth was. And the last person I want to highlight is Enolia McMillan, born again in Pennsylvania, educated at Howard University, and received her master's at Columbia University. She was a teacher. And the reason that is important is the road to Brown started with filing teacher salary equalization suits, which again started in Maryland. And because Enolia McMillan was the president of the Maryland State Colored Teachers Association, she was in the forefront of this effort to initially find equality within segregation. Remember, Plessy versus Ferguson said what? Separate but equal, all right? Said you can have separate facilities as long as they're equal. Of course, we knew they were separate, but they were damn sure not equal, okay? And so the strategy by Houston and other lawyers was, let's first have equality within segregation, because the idea was, if you make these two things equal, school systems will start to see it doesn't pay to have our money go in two different directions. We can pull it together and just, go in one direction. It's too much to have two separate systems and trying to finance them both on an equal basis. Again, money talks. And so you started to equalize teacher salaries because, unfortunately, Enolia McMillan and some of her fellow teachers, even though on average Black teachers were educated more than white teachers, of course, they were not paid the same as white teachers. And so McMillan would assist Thurgood and the local, the state conference of branches in filing individual lawsuits, because unfortunately, you had to go county to county to file these suits. And so she would provide the contacts and some of the funding and network in order to do that. Later on, she became the regional vice president of the National Colored Teachers Association. And then when the Maryland State Conference of NAACP branches were revitalized in 1941, she was its first president. So again, you see parallels between these three women in holding their leadership positions, and she will be succeeded actually by Juanita, when Juanita came back as president of the Maryland State Conference of branches. And so these three women would spearhead and guide and assist and support this burgeoning movement that is beginning in Baltimore with the effort to eliminate segregated education, which again started in Maryland when Donald Murray decided to sue the University of Maryland's law school in 1935. Now, I told you, segregation was complex in Maryland. At first, when other institutions were segregating, Maryland had its doors open to Black students in the late 1800s. They rescinded that in the 1890s and of the coming of the 20th century. So where they once let African-American students in, they finally shut the door after a while. And so Donald Murray filed this lawsuit. Of course, Thurgood Marshall, who you see standing, was the lead attorney. That's Charles Hamilton Houston sitting down. Even though he was there, of course, he wanted Marshall to get his feet wet with this particular case. And so the campaign Road to Brown officially started equalizing teacher salaries in Anne Arundel County, Maryland, and achieving success. It took years, but eventually they were able to equalize teacher salaries. And of course, they took that to the March on Annapolis, which was one of the first marches. We of course hear about the March on Washington in the 1963, but we have to understand that there were marches previous and prior to that. And one of them was the March on Annapolis, which unfortunately addressed police brutality that was happening, rampant around both Baltimore and the city itself. And due to time, I'm gonna have to speed up a little bit, but I definitely want to give you the gist of the accomplishments of these three women and the organization that they led. It should also be known that before Brown even came down, Baltimore already had a plan to desegregate schools and had already started doing so by the time that the Brown decision came down from, of course, the Supreme Court in May of 1954. And that again is because of the groundwork that Jackson and Mitchell and McMillan had laid to prepare the city and the state for what they believed was, an inevitable ruling. And so they, in association with the Baltimore Urban League and other civil rights organizations, were able to integrate Polytechnic Institute in 1952. And they were on course to integrate several others before Brown came down and assisted the city board in preparation. And so again, by the time the Brown decision came down, Baltimore had already been working on a plan to start integration that coming fall. NAACP, and for those of you who may not know, the tall gentleman is Paul Robeson, famous actor, activist, singer. Started protesting early in the 1940s against segregated institutions such as Ford's Theater. The NAACP Youth Council would picket a new target. No one had before that had ever heard of picketing, your water bill and your electricity bill. But of course, like most things, African Americans were being charged more for those particular utilities than white citizens were. And so they had to address that as well. And there was another early organization, the Civic Interest Group, who, the gist of it, we always hear about the famous student sit-ins February 1st, 1960 in Woolworths in Greensboro, North Carolina. But what we don't hear is students in Baltimore have been doing so since the early 1950s. And by the time of 1960, students in Baltimore had actually been desegregating some of these ice cream parlors and shopping centers and things of that nature. And some of that was due to the work of the Civic Interest Group, which started out at Morgan State University and would later on become an independent organization. And the president for a long time is the young man pictured, Clarence Logan. And so again, Baltimore would be ahead of the curve in some instances, more so than the national civil rights movement. And again, another example of them desegregating Reed's drugstore, and note the date, January of 1955. So again, Baltimore started some of this early. It would be a long struggle. Some, places would not acquiesce quickly. Some, it took years, such as the Northwood Theater, which ironically was right near the campus and was patronized by African Americans, but again, they were segregated, could not work there. And so they also picketed that institution as well as starting protests along what was then Route 1. Before Route 95, there was Route 1 to connect you from DC to New York. And of course, there were segregated businesses, hotels like Howard Johnson and others. And so C took their activities out of the city and started protesting those establishments as well. And of course, we would know later on, CORE will also do freedom rides. But in some instances, CORE got some of this from what C was doing. And so we come to some of the firsts that Baltimore achieved. First state to integrate graduate and professional schools, equalize teacher salaries. And of course, these legal victories would be trickled down to the South because that was also part of Houston's strategy. We establish legal precedents and then we take them further down South. Marched on the state capitol to protest police brutality and presented grievances to the governor during World War II. Desegregated a school before racial segregation was declared unconstitutional and complied with the Brown ruling immediately. Baltimore NAACP was involved in involving students in voter registration drives in the 1950s. We usually hear about this in the 1960s, but Baltimore was doing so in the 1950s. And again, student protest organizations were integrating public accommodations before 1960. And so again, you have this place that in many instances gets lost in the shuffle, but because of the extraordinary leadership Juanita Jackson Mitchell, her mother Lillie Carroll Jackson, and Enolia McMillan, who after Dr. Jackson would retire in 1970, Enolia McMillan would not only head the branch, but her work was so important that the NAACP decided to move their national headquarters from New York City to Baltimore, where they still exist as that today. So in one instance, McMillan was the president of the Baltimore branch and the national NAACP at the same time. And she was the first woman to actually serve as president of the NAACP. So in wrapping this up, I just wanted to highlight some trailblazers, some pathfinders, and put them on the radar because, of course, as Black women, they deserve their shine as much as the Dr. Kings, as much as the Thurgood Marshalls, as much as the Dr. Du Bois. And of course, we appreciate all their efforts and their current efforts. And in closing, I just want to say, hopefully from now on, we'll trust the 92%. Thank you very much. Yes, ma'am.
I don't have a question yet. It may come, but I have memories. I grew up in Baltimore. I was a part of the first group to desegregate Western High School. And what I remember, many things I remember, but one of the things that was true in Baltimore that I don't think you mentioned was that places would decide to serve us as African Americans on this Thursday, and next Thursday they would not be interested in. So we never knew for quite a long time. It seemed to me, I think, pretty much it felt like much of my adolescence. We were going to restaurants that we ate at last week, and this week they were saying we don't serve Negroes. So it was crazy making in that way, because one of the things about solid segregation was, despite all the horrors, it was solid. You knew where you were, you knew, Virginia, my experience with Virginia was not like that. It just was, we don't want you, we want your money, put it on the counter, don't touch me, I may turn Black.
Yeah.
Was what they were being taught, white folks who were cashiers were being taught. So, and it was always, and you knew, you go to the store, you put the money down, whatever. Baltimore, you depend on the person. It's very, very, I think, important.
Thank you for that. And that brings up an important point. In some instances, segregation wasn't black and white. It was a lot of gray. As she said, there were certain days, I talk about this in a dissertation, but I did not get a chance here. When you're talking about state parks and golf courses, they would have particular days that African Americans could attend, like Thursday.
Yeah.
But again, only African Americans could use it. No other groups could use it. Even if you belong to the club, whites were prevented from using the facilities on those days.
One more thing that occurred to me that you may or may not know, just what I'm afraid. In addition to not knowing where we stood, there were also situations where we were treated respectfully by one member of the team that was selling things, whatever, and totally disrespectfully by another. So that was something else that we had to keep in mind and watch for and remember faces and all of that, so that we weren't consistently putting ourselves in a position of being disrespectful publicly. So there was all that. So I just am mentioning these things because I really want people to understand there was not only the Jim Crow land that we couldn't move out of, it was also the crazy making piece of that in Maryland, which really didn't know whether it was deep south or whether it was high south,
Up south or
that's right.
yes, it's again, thank you for that. I really appreciate that. It was all of these isms, racism, sexism, xenophobia, they don't make any sense. They don't make any sense. I'll give you an example of how crazy this was. during the 1960s, of course, Kennedy is in office. We're in the midst of the Cold War. We're trying to appeal, to African, countries that are coming out of colonialism in Africa and Asia and Central, Latin America and things of that nature. Sometimes these segregated establishments would cater to Africans, but not African Americans. And in many instances, they were darker.
Yes.
So one of the things that I didn't mention is one of the things Juanita Jackson and her, her friends used to do was, because Juanita, I told you she was extraordinary, she spoke French. So as you say, one day they would come in, they would not be served. The next day they would come in with turbans on their head, speaking French, and they would be served. They didn't change their appearance, they just put a headdress on, changed their language, but would be served. But again, if they would take those turbans off and speak English, then the very next day, they would be denied again.
And they would not be allowed, we were not allowed, once the stores started opening, once the total split ended, we were not allowed to try on anything.
Oh, yes.
That touched our hair or that touched our skin, right? So that meant you had to play a guessing game when you purchased.
You had to know your
And you
exact
got home
sizes.
and it didn't fit. It wasn't like you could take it back. You gave it to some free, research of your friends to find out whose head worked or who, liked this dress,
Yes,
for example.
yes. Again, I wish, of course, I could go all day with this. There's just so much to, again, and this is kind of indicative of a number of movements that I've studied as well. Depending on where you are, the circumstances may be different. As I said, sometimes in Maryland, they were even more hardcore than the places we expected to be, like Birmingham, Alabama, like Jackson, Mississippi, like New Orleans, Louisiana, which of course are deep, deep South. In some instances, Maryland tried to outdo them in, being the most racist, the most segregationist. And so again, you get a lot of examples of African Americans trying to navigate this. And of course, again, other people of color as well, because, if you were Jewish, if you were Asian American, if you were Mexican, if you were, those groups during that particular time, depending on where you were in the United States, whether that's Texas, right here in California, in Florida, with Cuban Americans, and, wherever, you can find yourself victimized by these particular laws. And of course, also on an international level too, in the aftermath of the Spanish American War, when the United States acquired the Philippines in 1898, because they were darker skinned, they were referred to them in American newspapers as little negritos, little blacks. And so they extended, and Hawaii as well, when the United States annexed Hawaii, the people there in cartoons in American newspapers were painted as Negroes, simply because they were people of color. So they equated anybody that was a person of color with being, inferior and being a Negro. So you saw the Queen of Hawaii, she looked like a mammy character. They crafted her as a mammy character. And when they talked about, the Filipinos, because of course the Filipinos not only tried to fight against the Spanish, but they also in some instances fought against the United States, trying to take them over too. In order to denigrate them and justify their treatment, they would paint them as black folks to justify that. So again, this was also international as well. And again, it's unfortunate. And of course, we know that even though we're, particularly experiencing in the United States, white supremacy is global. That's very clear about that. White supremacy and its flip side, black inferiority, is global.
Excuse me,
Yes.
Ms.
Sure.
It's also important, I think, to acknowledge that during that period when interracial relationships were illegal, it was also true that homosexuality was illegal.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember having a gay junior high school teacher guy that I liked a lot. And then waking up one morning and the afro newspaper had him, because it was a black school, of course, had him on the front page being hauled off to prison because a cop had gone into his bedroom, they'd gotten a word, whatever, I mean, somebody had a belief in gay men. And they said, oh, I know this guy, let's follow him. And there he was. So it was like a total humiliation as well as other consequences, like never get a job again, all that kind of stuff. So people who were both colored or Negro and gay were dealing with that and undercover while dealing with all this other garbage out in the open. It's a wonder we're not all running mad down the street.
It's funny you say that again. Thank you very much for that. I definitely appreciate that. Richard Pryor said that. I won't use the word he, of course, used, but he's like, it's a wonder why don't go mad. It's a wonder why we haven't gone just absolutely nuts. And there's nothing to say we're not justified in that. But again, I think it speaks to the resiliency. I think it speaks to the resolve. I think it speaks to the community connections. I think it speaks to the familial connections. I think it speaks to the hope that we have, that, we've been through things like this before, and we will beat that as well. We will see ourselves on the other side. And of course, this is for other oppressed and marginalized communities as well. That there's this sense that, the light will shine sooner or later. We won't be in this darkness forever. And but again, with everything that is, and I want to say, the ultimate goal of white supremacy, of Jim Crow, was not only to restrict your movements and your material well-being, but it was to make you feel inferior. It was to make you feel inferior. Dr. Carter G. Woodson said it best. He said, if you control a man's education, you don't have to worry about him going to the back door. He'll go there naturally. His education makes it necessary. So you don't have to question that. And again, I think that's why education has been so attacked and that's not to say that people who are not as educated are less intelligent. How many people by show of hands know smart, dumb people? People you would expect to be smart, but they are absolutely not. Okay, absolutely not. Some of the people that I know have the most common sense don't have PhDs, don't have MAs, don't have some of them barely pass high school. But that doesn't mean diminish their intellectual capacity. It just may mean they may have been bored or not as invested. I mean, high school, hell, I didn't like high school that much myself either. I'm glad I got out. I'm proud I got out. But again, if you're not as well educated, in some instances, you are better able to be, as Malcolm said, hoodwinked, bamboozled, and led astray. And we are seeing that. We are seeing the results of that in this climate today, where some people, it's a cult to me. It's a cult. It has vestiges of a cult, to where people justify any and every act, no matter how insane it is, how detrimental it is, even to them, and how, again, I have a saying that I say to my students. I say, you will drive yourself crazy trying to figure crazy out. You'll drive yourself crazy trying to figure crazy out. So in some instances, don't even attempt to do so, because it's never going to make sense. It's never going to make sense. It's never going to be logical. So, protect your peace, do whatever you need to do, control the things that you can control, hope for the best, but of course, prepare for the worst as well. And of course, find your community and coalesce with like-minded people and allies, and, to get through this, because in some instances, some people may be converted, but for the most part, some people are too far gone. And so it's not even worth wasting your time, because you're the only they could care less. You're the one that's gonna be thinking about it. They could care less. So don't even waste the energy.
Well, with that, I'd like to thank Dr. Gass for amazing, and thank you once again, Dr. Gass.
Thank you.